March 7th, 1945. 14:35 hours. Remagen, Germany, the east bank of the Rhine. Unterofficer Friedrich Weber lay in the mud where he'd fallen, blood soaking through his torn uniform from shrapnel wounds in his side and leg. Around him, the sounds of American forces securing the Ludendorff Bridge echoed. Shouts in English, tank engines, the methodical advance of troops who'd just achieved the impossible by capturing a Rhine bridge intact. Weber's rifle lay 3 meters away where he'd dropped it. His hands were empty, pressed against his wounds in a futile attempt to slow the bleeding. 24 years old, a Wehrmacht veteran of 3 years, he'd survived France, Russia, and now this, the collapse of the fatherland's last natural barrier. Through pain-blurred vision, he watched American soldiers approach. 3 of them, weapons ready, moving cautiously through the carnage of the failed German counterattack. Weber closed his eyes. This was how it ended. He'd been told since training what happened to prisoners: torture, execution, atrocities too horrible to name. Better to have died fighting, but the shrapnel had stolen that choice. The American's boots stopped beside him. Weber heard English he couldn't understand, the metallic click of weapons being handled. He whispered the only prayer he remembered from childhood, waiting for the bullet. Instead, hands, surprisingly gentle, rolled him onto his back. Weber opened his eyes to see an American medic kneeling beside him, already pulling medical supplies from his pack. Another soldier held a canteen. "Water?" the soldier asked, in terrible German. Weber stared. This wasn't right. The propaganda had been explicit. Americans killed prisoners, didn't offer them water. He must be hallucinating from blood loss. But the canteen touched his lips, cool metal against cracked skin, and water, clean, cold water, flowed into his mouth. He drank desperately, some rational part of his brain noting that poisoned water wouldn't be this clean, this real. When he finished, the medic was already cutting away his uniform to expose the wounds, hands working with professional efficiency that spoke of saving lives rather than ending them. "Morphine," the medic said, showing Weber the syringe before injecting it. The American wanted him to see it wasn't poison, wasn't torture, just pain relief for an enemy who moments ago had been trying to kill Americans defending this bridge. As the morphine dulled the agony, Weber's last coherent thought before unconsciousness was profound and shattering. Everything they told us was lies. The propaganda of death. German soldiers had spent years being conditioned to fear capture more than death itself. The Wehrmacht's training materials were explicit. Allied forces, especially Americans, showed no mercy to prisoners. Captured German soldiers would be tortured for information, mutilated for sport, executed once they'd served propaganda purposes. The conditioning was systematic. Training films showed supposed atrocities. Officers repeated horror stories, and the message was reinforced constantly. Fight to the last bullet. Save the last bullet for yourself. Never surrender. By 1945, as Germany's military situation became desperate, the propaganda intensified. Goebbels's broadcasts described Allied terror bombing and claimed captured German soldiers faced systematic execution. Officers told their men that surrender meant certain death. You'd be shot immediately or slowly tortured. The few who survived would be worked to death in slave camps. Better to die with honor fighting than face what the enemy would do. This wasn't just propaganda. It was psychological warfare against Germany's own soldiers. The Nazi leadership knew that troops who believed surrender meant torture would fight harder, defend longer, die more readily. The lies served strategic purpose, delaying defeat by making German soldiers too terrified to quit fighting. The conditioning was remarkably effective. German soldiers would often fight to the point of exhaustion, burn through their ammunition completely, then attempt suicide rather than surrender. Others would continue suicidal resistance even when their position was hopeless, believing death in combat was preferable to capture. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, captured near Aachen in October 1944, described his terror. "We'd been told Americans would kill us immediately or torture us for days. When I was surrounded and couldn't escape, I tried to shoot myself. The rifle misfired. I expected the Americans to finish me brutally. Instead, they disarmed me, gave me water, and sent me to a collection point with other prisoners. I kept waiting for the torture to start. It never did. This pattern, expecting atrocity, experiencing basic humanity, repeated thousands of times as American forces advanced through Germany. Each repetition demolished propaganda that had seemed absolutely credible hours earlier. The reality of capture. American forces advancing into Germany in early 1945 were capturing German soldiers at unprecedented rates, thousands daily, as Wehrmacht cohesion collapsed. The scale created logistical challenges, but also opportunities for systematic demonstration of American values through treatment of prisoners. U.S. military doctrine, following Geneva Conventions, required humane treatment of POWs. But implementation went beyond legal minimums to include practices that actively contradicted German propaganda. The standard procedure when capturing German soldiers was straightforward. Disarm immediately, but without unnecessary violence. Search for weapons and intelligence materials. Provide water and basic first aid if needed. Move to collection points for processing. Feed from American rations. Transport to POW camps for long-term detention. This systematic humanity created cognitive dissonance for German prisoners who'd been taught to expect immediate execution or torture. The gap between expectation and reality was so profound that many prisoners initially couldn't process it. They'd wait for the real treatment to begin, unable to believe that water and rations were genuine rather than prelude to cruelty. Private James Henderson, 9th Infantry Division, described typical captures. Germans would surrender looking terrified. Some were crying, some praying. They expected us to shoot them. We'd give them water, search them, send them back to the POW collection point. The shock on their faces was universal. They couldn't believe we weren't going to kill them. Some would ask through interpreters when the execution would happen. We'd explain they were prisoners. They'd be treated according to Geneva Conventions. They'd look stunned, like we were speaking nonsense. The numbers revealed the scale of this systematic mercy. German POWs taken by American forces, June 1944 to May 1945, approximately 3.8 million. POW camps operated by U.S. forces in Europe, over 600 facilities. Daily caloric ration for prisoners, 2,200 3,000 calories, equal to or exceeding what German soldiers received before capture. Medical treatment provided to wounded prisoners. Estimated 180,000 received surgery or significant medical intervention. Mortality rate in U.S. POW camps in Europe, approximately 0.15% compared to 30% plus in Soviet camps. These statistics documented that American forces were systematically treating captured enemy soldiers humanely, feeding them adequately, providing medical care, and maintaining conditions that ensured survival rather than punishment. The water that changed minds. For German prisoners, the simplest gestures often created the most powerful psychological impacts, and nothing was simpler or more profound than being offered water by the enemy. Water required no translation. The gesture was universal, lifting a canteen to a wounded man's lips, offering drink to the thirsty. But, for German soldiers who'd been conditioned to expect execution, receiving water from American captors shattered propaganda instantly and irrefutably. Unteroffizier Friedrich Weber, recovering from his wounds after Remagen, described the moment's impact. I was bleeding, in agony, certain I would be killed. An American gave me water, just water from his canteen. But in that moment, everything I'd been told about Americans collapsed. If they were going to kill me, why give me water first? If they were monsters, why show kindness? That canteen of water did more to defeat my faith in Nazi propaganda than anything else could have. The symbolism was powerful, but the practicality mattered more. German prisoners were often dehydrated, combat was exhausting, defensive positions frequently lacked water supplies, and the stress of capture left men parched and desperate. American soldiers offering water weren't making grand gestures. They were responding to obvious human need with available resources. But to the recipients, trained to expect death, the water became evidence of American humanity that no propaganda could explain away. You don't give water to someone you're about to execute. You don't waste resources on people you consider subhuman. The water proved Americans saw German prisoners as humans requiring basic care rather than enemies deserving punishment. Corporal Thomas Riley described his routine. I'd offer water to every prisoner we took. It was automatic. You see someone who's thirsty, you give them water. I didn't think of it as psychological warfare or winning hearts and minds. But later, through interpreters, I'd hear prisoners saying that the water convinced them the propaganda about American brutality was false. Something that simple, sharing water, was apparently revolutionary to them. The food distribution. German POWs, discovering they'd be fed regularly and adequately, experienced another collapse of propaganda expectations. The rations provided to prisoners weren't minimal subsistence. They were substantial, often exceeding what German soldiers had received before capture. American military logistics, capable of feeding millions of troops across multiple theaters, extended the same supply efficiency to prisoners. Standard POW ration in American camps. Daily caloric intake, 2,200–3,000 calories. Composition: bread, canned meat, vegetables, coffee, sugar, occasional fresh food. Special provisions: extra rations for wounded or sick prisoners. Comparison: exceeded what German civilians received under rationing, matched or exceeded what Wehrmacht troops received by late 1944. For prisoners who'd been hungry for months, German military rations had deteriorated severely as supply lines collapsed. American food distribution created powerful impressions of wealth and organizational competence. Gefreiter Carl Schmidt, captured near Cologne in March 1945, described his shock. We'd been on reduced rations for weeks, half-starved, exhausted. When Americans captured us, they gave us American C rations, canned meat, crackers, chocolate, coffee. More food than I'd seen in months. Real coffee, not the ersatz garbage we'd been drinking. The abundance was staggering. I realized Americans can afford to feed their prisoners better than Germany fed its own soldiers. That told me everything about which side was winning and why. The chocolate included in rations became particularly symbolic. For German prisoners who'd gone years without such luxuries, receiving chocolate from captors created cognitive dissonance. Enemies don't give you chocolate. Executioners don't waste resources on luxury items for victims. The chocolate was proof that Americans viewed prisoners as people deserving decent treatment, rather than criminals awaiting punishment. The camps. German POWs sent to American camps in Europe and the United States discovered conditions that further contradicted every expectation their propaganda had created. The camps were organized, clean, adequately supplied. Prisoners received regular meals, medical care, shelter from weather. They weren't forced into brutal labor or subject to systematic abuse. Guards maintained discipline, but rarely used violence. The conditions weren't luxurious, but they ensured survival and basic dignity. The contrast with German propaganda was absolute. Prisoners had been told Allied camps meant starvation, torture, death. Instead, they found themselves in facilities where their biggest complaint was often boredom rather than abuse. Obergefreiter Hans Müller spent 18 months in a POW camp in Kansas. We worked on farms during the day, hard labor, but fairly compensated. We were fed well, housed adequately, treated without cruelty. The American guards were professional, not brutal. Some were even friendly. I gained weight in American captivity, while German civilians were starving. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was treated better as an enemy prisoner than my own family in Germany. The camps became sites where German prisoners confronted the gap between Nazi ideology and reality. They could observe American abundance, organizational competence, and basic humanity. Many underwent ideological transformation, abandoning Nazi beliefs through direct experience rather than formal re-education. The cigarette shared. Small gestures between American soldiers and German prisoners created humanizing moments that transcended propaganda and ideology. American GIs, many of whom were smokers, would often share cigarettes with German prisoners, offering a light, passing a pack, sitting together in silence while smoke curled upward from shared tobacco. These moments of casual humanity between recent enemies demonstrated that individual soldiers on both sides could recognize each other's common humanity despite being locked in deadly conflict. Private Eugene Martinez described such a moment. "We'd just captured a German position. One of their guys was wounded. Nothing serious, but he was shaken up. I was having a smoke when we were waiting for the medics. The German kept looking at my cigarette. I offered him one. He took it, I lit it for him, and we sat there smoking while the war continued around us. No words, we didn't share language. Just two guys sharing tobacco after trying to kill each other. It was surreal, but also human." For German prisoners, these small acts of sharing contradicted propaganda about American brutality more effectively than grand gestures could. Americans who shared their cigarettes, their water, their rations with captured enemies weren't monsters. They were men responding to shared human needs and recognizing common humanity. Unteroffizier Weber remembered, "An American soldier gave me a cigarette while I was waiting to be transported from the aid station. Just handed it to me, lit it, went back to his duties." That simple act, sharing tobacco with an enemy, told me more about American character than any propaganda could. Germans and Americans weren't different species. We were men who'd been fighting but could still recognize each other's humanity. The psychological collapse. For German POWs, the gap between propaganda and reality created psychological crises that forced reevaluation of everything they'd been taught. If Americans weren't monsters, what else was false? If enemy soldiers showed more humanity than your own propaganda suggested, what did that say about your side's claims? If the people you'd been fighting treated you better than your own government did, who were the real villains? This psychological transformation happened gradually. First came shock, the immediate recognition that expectations were wrong. Then came confusion, trying to reconcile propaganda with experience. Then came questioning. If this was false, what else? Finally came reassessment, rebuilding understanding of the world based on evidence rather than ideology. Feldwebel Otto Braun described his process. "For days after capture, I waited for the cruelty to begin. Americans had been too kind, surely it was a trick. But days became weeks, and the decent treatment continued. I was fed, my wounds were treated, I wasn't tortured or abused. Slowly, I had to face the truth. Everything I'd been told about the enemy was propaganda. If they'd lied about American treatment of prisoners, what else had they lied about? The Holocaust, the justifications for war, the righteousness of our cause. Everything became questionable once I recognized I'd been systematically deceived." This psychological transformation served American strategic interests better than any formal re-education program could achieve. Germans who'd been shown mercy by enemies they'd tried to kill became living refutations of Nazi propaganda. When repatriated after the war, they carried stories about American humanity that influenced post-war German attitudes toward the United States. The letters home. German POWs were eventually allowed to write letters home, creating additional opportunities for propaganda collapse, as families learned their captured relatives were alive and well treated. The letters described adequate food, medical care, fair treatment, contradicting everything German civilians had been told about Allied prisoner camps. Families expecting their sons and husbands to be tortured or dead instead received letters describing life in American custody that sounded better than life in wartime Germany. Unteroffizier Weber's first letter to his mother, written from a POW camp in Belgium in April 1945, stated, "I am alive and well. The Americans have treated my wounds and feed me regularly. I am healthy and safe. The stories about Allied brutality were lies, propaganda to keep us fighting. I wish I could have told you this sooner." His mother, living in bombed-out Frankfurt, received the letter with shock and relief. Her son lived, and the enemy she'd been taught to hate had saved him. The letter created ripples through her neighborhood as she shared the news. Other families with captured relatives began questioning the propaganda about POW treatment. These letters, multiplied across millions of German families with prisoners in Allied custody, created grassroots demolition of Nazi propaganda about enemy atrocities. The evidence came from trusted sources, family members, and couldn't be dismissed as Allied psychological warfare. The repatriation. When German POWs were repatriated after the war, they returned to Germany carrying memories and attitudes that shaped post-war reconstruction and German-American relations. The prisoners had experienced American organizational competence, material abundance, and systematic humanity. Many had been treated better as prisoners than they'd been treated as German soldiers. They'd seen that propaganda was false, that Americans weren't monsters, that the war's outcome had been inevitable given the vast gap in resources and organization between the sides. Friedrich Weber returned to Germany in early 1946. His family's home was destroyed, his father dead in the war, his city in ruins. But Weber himself was healthy, well-fed from American rations, carrying American-supplied clothes and modest savings from work in POW camps. "My mother cried when she saw me," Weber recalled. "She'd assumed I was dead. So many were. When I explained Americans had saved my life with surgery, fed me better than German soldiers ate, treated me humanely for months, she couldn't process it. We'd been told the enemy were beasts. Instead, they'd shown more humanity than our own government." That realization was painful, but necessary. The former POWs became a generation that remembered American mercy when vengeance would have been justified. They raised children with stories about enemies who'd given them water and saved their lives. These family narratives influenced post-war German attitudes toward the United States, creating foundations for democratic reconstruction and Western alliance that might not have been possible if American forces had treated prisoners as brutally as Nazi propaganda had predicted. The final truth. The story of German POWs expecting death but receiving water instead revealed fundamental truths about warfare, propaganda, and human nature. Propaganda could make soldiers believe enemies were monsters, until direct experience proved otherwise. The gap between expectation, torture, execution, and reality, water, food, medical care, was so profound that it shattered indoctrination instantly. No amount of ideological conditioning could survive the evidence of an enemy offering water to a wounded soldier who'd been trying to kill him. The American treatment of German prisoners wasn't perfect. There were instances of abuse, failures of protocol, moments when individual Americans behaved badly. But systematically, institutionally, American forces treated captured Germans humanely, following Geneva Conventions and often exceeding minimum requirements. This systematic humanity served multiple purposes. It was morally correct, legally required, strategically valuable, and practically sensible. But for individual German soldiers receiving that water, accepting that food, experiencing that medical care, it was simply the difference between the death they expected and the life they received. Friedrich Weber, who lived until 2003, spent his final years speaking to students about his war experiences. His message was consistent. "I expected Americans to kill me. They gave me water instead." That simple choice, mercy over vengeance, taught me more about civilization and humanity than anything else I experienced. The war was won through firepower and resources, yes, but the peace that followed was built on moments like mine, when individual American soldiers chose to offer water to dying enemies instead of letting us suffer as perhaps we deserved. That mercy created a different future than revenge would have built. In the end, the canteen of water offered to a wounded German soldier at Remagen symbolized something larger than individual kindness. It represented American commitment to fighting wars within moral constraints, treating enemies as humans even while defeating them decisively, and building peace through demonstrating that victory need not mean vengeance. For the millions of German POWs who survived American captivity, the memory of that unexpected mercy, water when they expected bullets, food when they expected starvation, care when they expected cruelty, remained the most powerful refutation of propaganda they'd ever encountered. And for post-war Germany, those millions of men carrying stories of American humanity became the foundation for a transformed relationship between former enemies who discovered they could be allies through choosing mercy over hatred.